So welcome to tonight's discussion with Dr. Margaret Frazer, the Senior Vaccines Medical Director at Pfizer, to discuss the COVID-19 vaccine development and her journey as a woman scientist, particularly about maintaining work-life balance. I'm Dorothy Teagarden, the Director of the Women's Global Health Institute. The Institute serves as a nexus of interdisciplinary research to create partnerships, promote research, and develop training opportunities to improve the health of women globally, with a focus on research on prevention and early detection. Joining us tonight, we are excited to have almost 350 registrants for tonight's co-sponsors for the event: the Purdue Institute of Inflammation, Immunology and Infectious Disease, the College of Health and Human Sciences, the Purdue Policy Research Institute, the Women in Engineering program, the Women in Science program, the Susan Bulkley Butler Center for Leadership Excellence, and the Advanced Purdue and the Center for Faculty Success. If you have questions for Dr. Frazer anytime during the interview, please enter them into the Q&A box, and we will cover as many as possible at the end of the interview. I'm very pleased to introduce the interviewer for tonight's discussion, Dr. Richard Kuhn, who will introduce Dr. Frazer. Dr. Kuhn is the Trent and Judith Anderson Distinguished Professor in Science in the Department of Biological Sciences and the Clinical Family Director for the Purdue Institute of Inflammation, Immunology, and Infectious Disease. His research at Purdue has focused on the replication and assembly of the alpha viruses and the flaviviruses, making him an excellent interviewer for this particular talk. He has been involved in many fundamental studies examining the structure and assembly of enveloped viruses, including the first structure of the dengue virus. He's an elected fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology and the American Association of the Advancement of Science. Purdue honors include the selection of the prestigious Herbert Newby McCoy Award for outstanding research contributions. In addition to his current positions and other awards, many other awards, and other really important contributions to Purdue, he served as the department head of biological sciences for 11 years. We at the WGHI also thank him for his really unwavering support of the Institute, including serving on our internal steering committee. Thank you, Dr. Kuhn, for agreeing to serve as the interviewer for tonight's event.
Thank you, Dorothy, for introducing me. I'm really pleased that you were able to put this together and to have our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Margaret Frazer. Dr. Frazer graduated from Purdue University and got a bachelor's degree in my home department, which is biological sciences. From there, she went to the IU School of Medicine, where she got her MD degree, and then moved to the University of Iowa, where she got an internship in internal medicine. Following that, she came back to Indiana University, where she did a neurology residency. Dr. Frazer is a senior medical director at Pfizer. She has a research background in neuroimmunopathological disease, including Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis. She's launched and organizes the Central Indiana Neuropathy Support Group, is on the board of directors of the Indiana Multiple Sclerosis Foundation. She currently works in the vaccine research and medical affairs area for Pfizer. I should also say that she is a member of the Biological Sciences Alumni Advisory Committee, and she does so much more. And I think in the next hour, we're going to hear about her career, her thoughts. We're going to hear about her involvement with the COVID-19 vaccine from the Pfizer perspective. So, Dr. Frazer, thank you so much for being here and giving us your time and your thoughts today. Let me start off with an easy first question, and just besides the details that I gave, tell us a little bit about how you got where you are today. What was that path, and how does a clinician wind up working with Pfizer?
Well, it's an interesting journey. And I should also say, as an aside, I didn't grow up my whole life thinking that I was going to be a physician. I was going to be the person that tried to identify the cure for cancer. And when I got to Purdue, I quickly realized when I looked in microscopes that I got motion sick. So I thought lab research is not going to work for me. And my mother at the time suggested I consider going to become a physician, and that's how that initially transpired. I knew that I wanted to be a neurologist because I felt like that was the last frontier of medicine. I thought we knew a lot about the heart, the kidney, and so on, but the brain, perhaps not so much. And that maybe in my lifetime, we would identify a lot of very interesting opportunities for treatment in my lifetime. And that has really turned out to be true, particularly in the areas of multiple sclerosis. I wound up at Pfizer, though, through a very unusual circuitous route, and I'm glad it happened that way. I had been at Geisinger Clinic in Pennsylvania for almost 5 years, and I came back to the Indianapolis area, having grown up in the Chicago area, and thought it was a nice central location for a lot of my family. And I went to work at Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, and I worked doing Alzheimer's research at IU as a clinical neurologist at that time. And I was pregnant with one of my children, and I have 9 daughters, which we can talk about a little bit later. I was pregnant with one of my children, and the group that I had joined, which was all male, had never experienced this before, that I might want to take a little bit of time off, and that when I came back, I might want to cut back on my schedule a little bit. So I did do that. And while I missed patients and was so happy to get back to them, the contract was truly awful. And I signed it anyway because I was the primary breadwinner. And this is how fortuitous being open to all possibilities is. I was having my hair cut shortly after I had returned to seeing patients. And the person cutting my hair said, "Are you happy to be back?" And I said, "Well, I really missed my patients, but I'm not happy at all with my contract." And she said, "Well, my husband just took a job with Pfizer. And I think he said that they were looking for a neurologist. And could you fax my CV to him, or could you to me, and I'll give it to him?" And I did that evening. He sent it to the person who wound up hiring me in New York. The person who was in New York asked me, he said, "We are coming to Chicago to do an interview process. Could you come up there?" And I said, "Sure." Went up there, interviewed for a position I knew nothing about at the time. I didn't even know that the industry had medical affairs positions. Wound up interviewing for it and got the job. So it was really one of those things where if you remain open, you might find a very interesting career path. And I must tell you that every day I've been at Pfizer, which has been since October 16, 2000, excuse me. Every day I have been grateful that I have this position. I truly love my job at Pfizer.
Wow, that is certainly circumstances. And I think the interesting thing that you pointed out is taking advantage of opportunities, right? And ones that may have not been very clear from the outset. Tell me, what does a medical affairs director do? What exactly is that?
Well, and that's a great question. And it varies a little bit depending upon the therapeutic area, at least at Pfizer you're in. And my role is relatively unique to Pfizer. Other companies have something called medical science liaisons, and we do a little bit of that work, but a lot of what we do is wedded to the research unit. So we might identify potential research sites for our sponsored studies. We might help pair an investigator who's interested in investigator-initiated research in one of our products or in one of our shelved compounds, and that happens periodically. Some of what we do is education-based. Right now, in my current role in vaccines, for example, a lot of it is education-based. A lot of what I have done in the last year and a half since I've been on vaccines has been education-based. And that could be to healthcare providers. It could be to integrated delivery networks. It could be to managed care organizations. It might be to pharmacy benefit manufacturers. It might be to the government. And that is part of what I do. So it's very wide based. Every day is a different. So if you're someone who likes variety and is also very flexible, this would be a great job.
Wow. Talk about a jack of all trades. That sounds like a really great job. So let's now talk about COVID-19. How did you pivot when, Pfizer came on the scene and was a major player in terms of coming up with a vaccine strategy against COVID-19? What was that pivot? What did that look like to you? Was it just a progression from the medical affairs role that you were playing, or was there more to it than that?
That's a great question as well. So at the time the pandemic first started, I was doing cardiovascular medicine, which might sound strange for a neurologist. However, one of the compounds I was working on, well, two of them, one was identified in the neuroscience research unit, and the other one was designed for stroke reduction risk. And so that's why I was on that team. But I had always had a love of immunology, which is, again, speaks to the idea of keeping your range of interests as wide open as possible. And MS is highly immunologically based. So a lot of the treatments that I use, and I still see patients, I should add that Pfizer is a rare company in that they allow their physicians to still see patients. So I have an MS patient population as well. It's very immunologically based. I have always loved immunology. I had always wanted to go to the vaccines team, which was a global international team, different from some of the other teams at Pfizer, but it was a small team and they didn't really need anybody else. One of my colleagues left cardiovascular and went to vaccines, and he had said, you should consider, I know you're interested in vaccines, you should think about this because they need somebody to cover the Midwest region. You wouldn't have to move because at that time I still had kids in public school here. You wouldn't have to move and it would align with your interests. That was very early in that messenger RNA vaccine process. And really, they were expanding the team in medical affairs, in part because of our pneumococcal vaccination program and some of the other vaccines we still have in development. It really wasn't necessarily specific to COVID. However, once I came on board in the spring, things quickly became very COVID-centric. And much of the work that we wound up doing at that point was COVID 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, essentially.
Wow. So having said that, what has been the most challenging part of the vaccine development?
Well, one of the things that I have always loved about Pfizer has really been all of the brilliant individuals with whom I work. And I caution women sometimes about this, but I have to admit that I've had this as well, that imposter syndrome feeling about sitting with a group of other individuals and thinking, I don't think I really belong here. All of these people are brilliant and I don't feel as brilliant as they are. But I will say that it is very much a team effort. Everyone has been 100% engaged in the vaccines team. And I would say that the biggest challenge probably has been vaccine hesitancy, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. So early on, there was a great deal of excitement about the research program and the vaccine coming. And in fact, many healthcare providers were very, very excited. There were some stories about early vaccine delivery and how excited people were. It caught many of us off guard, particularly those of us who had been relatively new to vaccines, that there would be this very strong push against vaccines, particularly against this vaccine early on. And that there were all of these misinformation cycles that constantly needed to be addressed. I think that was and continues to be the biggest challenge that I see from a COVID-19 vaccine perspective.
Yeah, I certainly agree, being a virologist and knowing the background. And, certainly Moderna, I don't know about Pfizer, but Moderna had developed the Zika virus messenger RNA vaccine, but as we all know, Zika virus kind of dropped off the face of the earth. And so there was no point in moving to clinical trials. So yeah, always interesting. So what do you think right now? What's the challenge in terms of moving forward with kids that are going to be 5 to 12 years old? It looks like the CDC has recommended approval. We'll wait till the director makes that decision. But what do you see are the obstacles now in rolling it out to the 5 to 12-year-olds group?
Well, I think that's a great question. And there was some information presented today at the CDC meeting about that. It talked about, would a parent have their child be vaccinated? And this is United States related data. And it looked like it was about a 50-50 kind of split. And so that goes back to the vaccine hesitancy discussion. And I think perhaps the question might be, where is the vaccine hesitancy coming from? It's coming from, I think, fear of how this vaccine was developed so quickly. And we can talk about that in a little bit if there is interest on your part, Dr. Kuhn. But I think one of the things that I see from that 5 to under 12, that 5 to 11-year-old group that was just approved, is helping people understand that COVID-19, while by and large children are asymptomatic or have mild symptoms, unfortunately in this country, since COVID came about and we started tracking deaths, there have been roughly 750 deaths in the pediatric population. It is not something that is a simple disease state for which children are innocuously affected. And you think about, in comparison, measles, mumps, and rubella, varicella, hepatitis A and B, all of these diseases that we routinely vaccinate our children against, the deaths related to COVID in 1 year surpass those deaths, including deaths related to influenza. And I think that should give a parent pause when they're considering being vaccine hesitant and they're hearing that COVID is a relatively innocuous disease for a child. That's not necessarily the case. And with the exception of children and obesity and children who are immunosuppressed, we don't know why some children don't do well. We don't know what their risk is for a bad outcome. And I think that would be something that I would want to encourage people to know.
Yeah, I think that's a great set of points that you made. As a virologist and knowing we work on SARS-CoV-2 in my laboratory, knowing how well this virus grows and knowing its tropism to go to many different tissues, even if a kid gets infected, no symptoms, but high levels of virus, we don't know what organs, tissues that virus is replicating in. Question really will be, what happens 5 years from now, or 10 years, or 20 years from now? We know there are many examples of viruses that infect, people clear the virus, they get better, but then later on in life, there is some defects that emerge that were the result of that virus making an imprint on the body. So I think we have to be very cautious, and we do have tools that we can use to, prevent and mitigate infections. So, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So Dr. Frazer, what's it like to be the director of a large company like Pfizer? I mean, you talked a little bit about that. Tell us about kind of the day-to-day, operations that you work on.
Well, what is nice is that at Pfizer, it is a matrixed organization so that we can communicate with each other, and it is really very much a team approach. People don't necessarily work in isolation. And this has been true with all the therapeutic areas that I've worked in with Pfizer. Everybody has worked as part of a team. And if one individual needs assistance, another one will come to that person's assistance. I think the other thing is that they carefully choose their team membership so that everyone is complementary to each other. Everybody in our vaccines team has come from a different background, has a different level of expertise, and all of these individuals together have been able to formulate a tremendous kind of business plan or approach to the work. So a typical day is not very typical, but and there's pre-pandemic, and then there's pandemic, and then there's now, which is all changed, as you might imagine. Everything flipped to be very virtual on March 16th. So prior to that, it was a lot of traveling. For me, thankfully, my travel was relatively geographically condensed, so I could travel via car most of the time. But a lot of my work then and now, only now it's carried out virtually, is communicating with institutions within the region for which I have responsibility and helping them understand the clinical data points around our vaccine, potential side effect related questions they might have, vaccine distribution and allocation and rollout. All of those questions have been things that we have been working on for quite some time. And so those are really typical days. Now, you might hear from the Mayo Clinic one day or University of Chicago the next, but nonetheless, that is a lot of what we do. The other thing we might be called on to do is help a clinical trial program that is struggling a bit. So if we have product X that is in need of sites that could do research, they have the infrastructure and the capabilities to do research in that area, then we'll be called upon to assist. At Pfizer, there are research units. They are relatively well localized in Groton, Connecticut, Cambridge, Massachusetts, St. Louis, and La Jolla, for example. Those research units are relatively isolated. They don't have the capability of knowing the best research sites. But that's one thing that medical affairs can do differently, is we are embedded with these geographies, and so we're able to help that partnership. And that's a lot of what I do.
It sounds like a lot of a lot. It sounds like you're always in motion. And so those were the easy questions, right? Here's a more challenging one. Given what you just said about, thinking about all of the sites, all the things that are going on, how do you get this balance between work and family? And, 9 daughters, that's pretty substantial. You must have some interesting formula that you have to work that out.
Well, my kids could probably tell you some very fascinating stories about how this has worked. And work-life balance is something that it's not always 50-50. It's not always 70-30 or 60-40. So some days are busier than others. What this job has allowed me to do, though, which was different when I was in full-time practice, and the girls don't remember those times, when I might have been in the hospital on call on Christmas Day, for example. It might look like to them that I'm always working for Pfizer, but what I would have cautioned them on is working from home, with the exception of when I gave presentations and those were locked in times, or when I had a locked in meeting, I was allowed flexibility. So for example, I could respond to Mayo Clinic via email at 10 p.m. at night, but still be at their soccer game at 4:30 in the afternoon. It allowed me a lot of autonomy with my schedule, such that I could be with the girls at those important times. And so while it might have looked like I was working 24/7 because I was working from home, it allowed me to work 2 hours here and then be off for 90 minutes here, go walk the dogs and come back to work. So it allowed me to do those things. And it was probably good for me because it keeps that mental flexibility going from one task to another and then back to the original one.
Didn't you get the girls to walk the dogs?
Somehow they have never shared my delight in walking the dogs. And I don't know if a few of them are listening, but they know who they are if they are listening.
Yeah. So the 24/7 schedule, and not to be intrusive, but how much sleep do you get? I mean, you were emailing me the other night and it was like 10 or 11 o'clock at least. Maybe later.
Well, that's a great question too. And again, remember, we're in a pandemic circumstance, which means that life is different for everyone. Life has been upended for many of the people that are listening in today, if not everybody. And so I would say it comes in spurts. So probably that December to March timeframe was perhaps the busiest December to March timeframe I've ever spent at Pfizer. In the past, historically, Pfizer has been very quiet from roughly the middle of December till just after the new year, which was wonderful. This past year was quite a bit different because the vaccine rollout occurred in the second week of December. And so we were busy all the way up till Christmas Eve, and then busy again right after Christmas through New Year's Eve. And I had a period of calm, I would like to say, in September. And then with changes in our formulation for vaccine, for example, and then the pediatric data coming through, that made me work these crazier hours. But that's a long-winded answer to say I get enough sleep. I do get enough sleep.
So thank you for revealing that. How have your kind of MS patients or other patients that you have, how have they been impacted by the pandemic? I mean, have you seen a dramatic change in your duties as a clinician with patients outside of the COVID vaccine arena?
Yes, and that's a great question too, because originally when that lockdown occurred, we went to virtual appointments only for a brief period of time so that everybody could wrap their arms around how we needed to approach the individual patient. And so that was hard for people initially, although some patients really turned to love it. And what we realized as neurologists and rheumatologists, many other practices feel the same way and have been campaigning the government to allow for there still to be a virtual appointment option to continue once the pandemic resolves. Because there are individuals with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, for example, that I can see in their home environment. I don't need them to come in. I don't need them to struggle to come in. I can take a look at them. I can make tweaks in their medicine without them coming to visit. In the MS patient population, they represent the immunosuppressed individuals by and large, because most of my MS patients I have on immunosuppressive agents. So they have been very, very careful and have been reluctant to come into the office, although they have been doing so in the last 5 to 6 months. But they recognize that they are in a tenuous position, because I think we know that and this is true for all vaccines. Vaccines require an immune system that's ready to go when primed by the vaccine. If you're immunosuppressed, whether it be naturally, or because you have cancer, or because you're on an immunosuppressive treatment, then that's going to keep your immune system from responding as effectively as you might like it to. So there have been a lot of conversations I've had with patients about the best timing for their vaccines. Certain immunosuppressive agents we're beginning to learn might have a B and T cell effect, for example, at one time point, and we can go ahead then and deliver the vaccine in a certain time frame right before they're due for their next treatment, for example. And I think that has helped them feel more comfortable. But many of them are reluctant to re-engage. They're reluctant to re-engage with the family. They're reluctant to re-engage just doing the typical things that we take for granted, such as going to the grocery, in part because they don't know the vaccination status of everyone around them. And one comment I always make when I talk to my patients, particularly those that are a little hesitant about vaccines, is that vaccines are the one area of medicine that's different from every other. So when you think about taking your statin to lower your cholesterol, you're doing that for yourself because you would like to reduce your risk for MI and stroke. Vaccines you are giving yourself so that you can prevent yourself from illness, hopefully, or lower your risk. But it's the only thing you do with an altruistic aspect as well. You're getting that vaccine for the community in which you live.
Yeah, no, that is a great point, Dr. Frazer. You know, the 20th century was a century of public health, where the emphasis was on public. The 21st century has been a century of public health in which people think it's about them, you know, and really public health is about the community, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I don't want to. I'm going to turn it over to people asking questions. Let me ask one last one. What are your new challenges? What do you see on the horizon that's going to, you know, get you up a little earlier or keep you up a little later at night?
Well, I think that we're still dealing with the current challenge for a period of time, and I don't know when that's going to be exhausted. But, I think people, and this is true for medicine in general, we don't cure much in the way of medical illness. We cure certain infectious disease. We can cure certain cancer types, but most of the time we treat illness. Illness becomes chronic. And I think that's something that people need to remember. So we always need to be looking for additional therapies that are easier to tolerate and potentially more effective, whether it's hypertension or whether it's hyperlipidemia or whether it's infectious disease. Infectious disease is a huge concern going forward. Antimicrobial resistance globally and in the United States is a very real concern. And so continuing to look for new agents in the infectious disease world is key. In the neuroscience world, since the time I left medical school, we have not made much in the way of inroad for Alzheimer's disease, for example. The path from a research span toward Alzheimer's disease is littered with failures. That's actually one reason why I left the neuroscience portfolio at Pfizer and moved into cardiovascular, because we had just had our most recent failure in Alzheimer's disease. We had failures in Parkinson's disease. So the holy grail in neuroscience is neurorestorative and neuromodulation, and we're not close. So there's plenty of potential issues. In terms of vaccine preventable disease, we're not there yet either. There are diseases that still affect children. RSV as a virus, for example, still puts way too many babies in the hospital. Those are some of the things that I look at as challenges.
Yeah. Hey, it's funny that you mentioned RSV, because the work that was done on RSV, the spike protein of RSV, really structural biology, really led the way. And it was the same team from the Vaccine Research Center that were able to translate that over to the SARS S protein. So interesting that you mentioned that, Dr. Frazer. Well, I could ask a whole bunch of other questions, but I thought let's turn it over to our audience so that they can ask some questions. So I'll turn it over to Professor Didak to moderate the questions.
Yes, well, thank you so very much, Dr. Frazer and Dr. Kuhn, for this engaging conversation and for sharing your insights on this development and importance of the COVID-19 vaccine, as well as your insights as to a successful career as a female scientist, both in industry and in the medicine branch. I'm Ulrike Didak, the Associate Director of the Women's Global Health Institute at Purdue, and I have now the pleasure to moderate the questions that have come in the meantime from the audience. To the audience, please note that you can ask any further questions during this time now, and by just typing them into the Q&A box. And I will read them out loud and have Dr. Frazer and Dr. Kuhn answer them. So let me get started with one of the first questions that came in to Dr. Frazer. The person wanted to know if you were directly involved in the development of the COVID-19 vaccine, or more exactly what your role in that part is.
Yes, so that's a great question. The people within the research unit were directly involved in the work on the COVID vaccine. And I think that what my work has been, I would say much of the lion's share of my work has been helping actually with understanding what vaccines do, understanding how our developmental milestones occurred. And I can go back and talk about vaccine research and how it looked during the pandemic, because that was very different. Educating on that, helping plan educational efforts to large institutions about the vaccine. So my role was much more in terms of information dissemination and education and research site dissemination than it was in the actual vaccine discovery. That was a very small group of scientists. One thing, though, that I would like to add, because I have been thinking about this since Dr. Kuhn asked originally about one of the most difficult circumstances that I've been encountering, which is the vaccine hesitancy. A lot of the concern, and I certainly understand it, has been about the rapidity with which this vaccine and all the COVID vaccines have been developed. So what I always tell people when I answer this question is that messenger RNA from a vaccine perspective has been looked at for about 2 decades, just about. A lot of it has been looked at from a cancer perspective, but it's been looked at as an infectious disease as well, as Dr. Kuhn pointed out. So that preclinical time period is not different than other vaccine development. What was different this time around, and why we couldn't take years to develop a vaccine, is because we were in the middle of a pandemic. There was a pandemic preparedness task force that was put together after SARS-CoV-1 back in 2002 by the government at that time, because they knew then that that pandemic was not going to be the last one that we would see, nor is this pandemic going to be the last one that we see. And we need to figure out a way to address vaccine development as quickly as possible. In that interim period of time, there was the Middle Eastern respiratory virus that has never really affected people in the United States, but it is still an ongoing battle in the Middle East. And while it is not nearly as contagious as SARS-CoV-2, it has a much higher mortality rate. And then we have Ebola virus, which we are still seeing outbreaks of in certain areas of the world. But what we did, rather than doing phase of research sequentially, as you typically see, which is why vaccine development can take 10 to 15 years, we did them all concurrently. So phases 1, 2, and 3 were done concurrently. And if we typically have 30 to 60,000 subjects in a typical vaccine timeline for development over 10 to 15 years, we had 44,000 in our initial Pfizer sponsored study. So we were right in the middle of that 30 to 60,000 range. And people will say, well, but you haven't studied it long enough to look at long-term effects. If you take a look at vaccine development, the FDA has always wanted to know 60-day adverse event reporting, 60 days after the vaccine has been given or after the primary series has been given. And that is what was given to the FDA last November. It was truly very rapidly done because we had a number of people that were willing to jump into the trials. Our recruitment was an easier phenomenon than sometimes is seen in other vaccine trials because there were so many people who wanted to be a part of our trials and Moderna's trials and AstraZeneca's trials and Janssen's trials. Same thing, everybody wanted to be a part. And that is why we could shorten up this time frame in such a dramatic way. And I would say, if you go back, there's a wonderful book about the polio vaccine that I would encourage people to read. But there were several reasons why it took so long to be developed. And one was because the researchers went a completely wrong way for about a decade. And they lost a lot of time in that particular circumstance. And it wasn't as contagious a virus, or didn't appear to be at that time, as SARS-CoV-2. So there are a lot of reasons why vaccine development was so short. And prior to this time, the mumps vaccine was probably the fastest to development, and that was a 4-year time frame.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That gave me a lot of answers also to how to respond to some of these questions, as you mentioned, about like, what about long-term effects and how could it be so fast? Thank you so much for this answer. You mentioned, or Dr. Kuhn had already asked about one of particular hardship. We have one question in here about what was the coolest thing that you have ever done in your job or that you were able to experience as part of your job?
Well, there are probably a couple of things I would say. One was back in the Alzheimer's day. Now, it didn't come to fruition, but it was an opportunity to work with the FDA to help them to define clinical trials that could be shorter. So one of the problems with Alzheimer's trials are they're very, very expensive, and we come up with a negative result because it takes so long to demonstrate a clinical benefit. So I was the project manager for a project team that got to work with the FDA to identify a way to describe clinical trials such that we could have a more sensitive and objective measurement of either progression or improvement. So that was one. I would also say that working in the vaccines realm in COVID has been another. So being involved in December with training all of the early vaccinator sites was incredibly rewarding. It truly was. It was so rewarding to have people contact you and tell you how grateful they were for the work, that vaccinators would have tears in their eyes about having a vaccine in their hands that they could go out and vaccinate. That has been huge. And then on the other side of it, it's just hearing stories. So as I mentioned, I have probably given the vaccine confidence presentation, I would say no less than 90 times since the middle of December, probably, with some large audiences and some small audiences, but hearing feedback saying that the information I presented was clear and concise and they could understand it, and it was going to prompt them to go and become vaccinated was huge. Knowing that I might have that effect both at a smaller level as well as a broad level is huge. It's one of the reasons why I've loved coming to Pfizer. So I have loved having the opportunity to work with patients individually and take care of them individually. But being able to work on a larger scale, as I am in medical affairs at Pfizer, makes it just that much more exciting to be able to do things personally and then globally.
Right. And I think you just also answered already some of the other questions about what is Pfizer doing in response to the vaccination hesitancy. You just talk about these talks that you give on confidence. How do we learn about these talks? If I, for example, let's say I have family or friends I want to convince, can I send them to some of these? Is there information out?
Well, and that's a great question. So most of our talks, and I'm one of a team, and other people are doing the same type of work, clearly. A lot of our requests come from healthcare systems. Sometimes they come from employers. Sometimes they come from insurance companies. I've had several requests from school districts because they wanted teachers to become vaccinated, for example. So the requests come to us. I've had the opportunity to speak to some legislative groups nationally so that they can go out and speak to their communities with accurate information. And you're right, this vaccine confidence discussion needs to keep occurring because, as I mentioned before, the misinformation cycle is not stopping. It continues. There's new pieces of misinformation that crop up almost on a weekly basis, it seems, but there are still some old misinformation that unfortunately has stuck with us since early December and on even to today. So I think it's more encouraging individuals who might want to learn more about vaccine confidence to check in with their departments of health. So, for example, I know the Chicago Department of Health runs some seminars periodically, and I believe they're recorded on vaccine confidence. And I'm sure that's probably an example of many departments of health. The Immunization Action Coalition is another place I would tell you to go to. It is a very, very active website. They also have things that you can download for free. But that is a great place. They offer a lot of webinars. Going to the cdc.gov website, they have wonderful fact sheets for potential patients as well as for healthcare providers so that you can deal with the information. You can present the information about the vaccine in a clear and concise way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for this information. I think that answers some of these questions that we have there about what should I say if somebody says that, or and so on. I have another comment here, thanking about the terrific discussion. And could you please comment a bit about vaccination in children with asthma? In the adult and teen population, there didn't seem to be much of a correlation between asthma and response to natural COVID infection or vaccination. Do you expect a similar trend for the pediatric asthmatic patients?
Well, so that was an excellent question, and that was brought up at the ACIP today. And I'm not sure whether you mean COVID-related vaccination or vaccination in general for all vaccine preventable disease. And of course, I encourage vaccination for vaccine preventable diseases of all the vaccines that are fully approved by the FDA for children. COVID specific, they specifically queried our data today and wanted to know the two major risk factors for COVID-related potential complications in children are obesity and asthma. And those two medical conditions were specifically mentioned during our presentations today about our own pediatric vaccines. So those were very carefully considered as being significant risk factors for bad outcomes with COVID. And so those were patient populations that were included in our clinical trials.
Great. Okay. Now the next question goes more into the being a female scientist. Did you have any hardships by being a woman in STEM, or how did you manage to do the work when your children were infant aged? I hear your last set was a set of triplets. So I being a mother, working mother myself, I just cannot imagine how even working from home that could possibly work.
You know, and it's so funny because now that we're in a virtual world, people are always apologizing about their children and their dogs, it seems. But I can say that by and large, I have been very supported through my career. Now I'm going to go back and give you a caveat, though. It's something that wouldn't happen today that happened when I applied to medical school. But I will say Pfizer is unbelievably inclusive, and they are very supportive of promoting women to leadership roles. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, I was promoted into a team leader position within vaccines. But they are very, very inclusive of minority individuals, but particularly women. But I'll go back and tell you a little story about when I applied to medical school that would not be allowed now. So the question to me was, when I had my interview, are you planning on getting married? Because I wasn't married then. And if so, are you planning on having children? And if so, are you going to be taking time off, or are you going to work full time? Because I want you to tell me why we should offer you a spot over a fully qualified male if you think you might be taking time off as a physician, because these spots are precious. We need to make sure that any physician we train is going to go out there and work full time. So that kind of gives you a little bit of some of the flavor of what my interview process was like going into medical school. And we could see that a little bit in medical school and residency. When I was in medical school, about 18% of my class was female. And most people were very welcoming and very supportive, but you did run into some circumstances that would never, ever fly today while you were in training or out of training, for that matter. When I first went to the Geyser Clinic, there are some stories I could tell that would probably make your toes curl, but nonetheless, things have improved so substantially. I have not found anyone who is not supportive of women scientists. since I have joined Pfizer in 2000. And I think the world is so open to all of you. The one comment that I would make, and I really have to attribute it to my mother, who said, keep your options open at all times. And I cannot reiterate that enough. And go beyond your immediate comfort zone. If you don't feel comfortable public speaking, for example, make yourself public speak a little bit. Push yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone, because then you'll identify opportunities you would have never known had existed. And by the same token, don't lock yourself into thinking, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z if you are just beginning your college career or your graduate career. I didn't know anything about the current job that I'm in 20 years ago, but I have loved every minute of it. And again, those are things you may not even have an opportunity to explore until you're somewhat into your career. Midlife, I encourage people to take career changes and career chances. My kids have heard me say this a million times. You spend most of your life at work. You want to do something that you enjoy, that you love, and that you think will make a difference. At least that's important for me. It's got to be something that makes a difference in the world. And then you also want it to be something where you appreciate, respect, and maybe even love the individuals with whom you work. And I think that's important as well.
Wow. Thank you so much.
I didn't really answer the juggling question because it has been difficult. The triplets were an exciting finale. And I have one, Jessica, who is at Purdue as a freshman this year in the Honors College. And so that's fun. It gives me another excuse to come back to Purdue, which I appreciate. But each one of my girls has been an unbelievable joy. And while there have been some crazy opportunities, and I can tell you this story as well, I gave a Massachusetts Medicaid presentation on a product from inside my car with my windows rolled up and my doors locked, while some of my girls ran around the outside of my car trying to get my attention. So there, I could tell you stories all night long about some of the work-life balance issues, but it all works out. It all works out.
Wonderful. Good to hear. Good to hear. There's one more question that's a bit related to this, asking about any strategies or suggestions for female managers or women in leadership positions.
I think that there are a couple of things. One is to remain open to suggestions, to really listen to, if you can find a mentor, that's probably the best thing you can do. If you can find a mentor that you respect and trust, that person will often help you navigate those early challenges that might occur in the managerial role that you might not be ready for. Being a manager or a team leader is a different role than being a direct or individual contributor as a scientist, because sometimes being a team leader or manager means that you are managing people. You're going to have direct reports. And so you want to work on your people skills in addition to your business skills, in addition to knowing what that role really means, even perhaps before you interview for that particular role. I think that having as your core value respect for people will make all the difference as you go forward in the world. Respecting each other, perhaps even if you don't agree with that individual, makes a big difference in how you move forward.
Okay, wonderful. Now I'm jumping back. We still have a few minutes, I think, because we still have quite a few questions in there. I'm jumping back to COVID about the natural immunity. So could you please discuss natural immunity from having had COVID-19, and how does it compare to immunity from having the vaccine? And what do you tell to people who say, well, I don't need to get vaccinated because I've had it and I have natural immunity? Does the vaccination enhance immunity after having had an infection? Thank you.
Well, there is a lot of data out there right now that has been published. Some has been published, some is not, and is under peer review. Some is Pfizer-related data, and some is not. The data that's recently been presented to the FDA and the CDC over the last 2 weeks shows that people who develop COVID naturally still have a significantly higher risk of being hospitalized than people who are vaccinated and develop COVID. So even though you might have a natural immunity, it doesn't always protect you from serious sequelae, and it may not be as protective against the Delta variant as the vaccinations appear to be. And I should add that all of the current vaccinations look to be very protective against the Delta variant. I want to make a comment about the Delta variant just for a moment. The Delta variant, I think we all know, is very, very contagious. We know, we have been reading in reports that people who are vaccinated are testing positive again for COVID. Testing positive for COVID versus being hospitalized for COVID, being from dying from COVID are totally different things. The virus divides very, very quickly in your nasopharyngeal area, which is where you test for COVID positivity, and it does allow for transmission. You need a very high level of antibodies in your nasopharynx to take care of the virus quickly, whether you have it naturally or whether you've been vaccinated. And it doesn't matter what vaccination it is. That's true for all vaccinations. After you've been vaccinated, antibody levels wane with time. What you're hoping for is that your memory B cells are there ready to re-engage when encountering the pathogen. But that takes time. It takes time for the memory B cells to develop those antibodies to fight against the infection. So yes, you may be vaccinated and you may test positive for COVID. But what we're noting is that people who are not vaccinated are 11 to 15 times more likely to wind up in the hospital and or to die than those who are vaccinated. And those are the rates to hold on to. People also, I think, are confused about the idea of a primary series versus a booster. And they're concerned about the fact that, well, we took 2 shots, if you had a messenger RNA vaccine, 2 shots up front, and now they're asking us to have a booster. First of all, I would say that remember back last December, we indicated that it was highly likely come this fall you were going to need a booster. So this shouldn't be new information. But second of all, those 2 initial shots were considered your priming dose. They prime your immune system, and they were compressed in time so that you could quickly mount an immune response in the face of a pandemic. But we have lots of evidence. We have lots of prior vaccinations where we have priming and boost. A perfect example is the pneumococcal vaccination in babies. You give the pneumococcal vaccination at 2 months and 4 months and 6 months, and then again at 12 months. You give 4 total pneumococcal vaccinations to a child because you're giving a prime and a boost. So again, this is not an unusual circumstance, and people shouldn't look at that as evidence of vaccine failure.
Right. So I'm going to ask one last question before ending this. That goes again a little bit along with this, because there was, so should we regard COVID as something that will stay with us, similar as to the flu, and there might be other booster shots or other types of shots maybe that we'll have to take in a couple of years again, or that we have to take every year just as for the flu, because some things are changing and evolving over time?
Well, and that's an excellent question. And that was even brought up last December as well, that it might become endemic. This virus might become endemic like influenza viruses and such that will require a yearly vaccine. We don't know the answer to that yet, but yes, it is possible. People have asked, how do we best guard against future significant variants of this virus? This is a zoonotic virus, so it travels between humans and animals and humans again. The best way to cut down on viral mutation rates is to cut down on human-to-human transmission, which means we need people to be vaccinated. And that's our best path forward through this pandemic.
Okay, great. And then there was one last comment. If you could please mention maybe the book that you mentioned before on the polio vaccine, if you do know the title, or maybe you let us know and we'll put it on our webpage at the end.
I will try to get that information to you, but if you Google, if you look at Amazon, it's actually available on Amazon. It's polio. I can't remember the first author. It talks about the history of polio in an easily digestible format. It's a very story-like, and it's just called Polio.
Okay.
That's all, and it's roughly, I don't know, 400 to 500 pages probably.
We'll find it, and we can definitely also post this information.
Great book. There's another one on smallpox that I'm about halfway through. Another great book.
Wonderful. Well, we will need to end at this point, so I do want to thank you and Dr. Kuhn again for this inspiring discussion. Please all join me in giving both a virtual thank you and applause. And I also want to tell the audience, please visit the Women's Global Health Institute website for the video link to the recording of this interview. It will take a few days or maybe even a week or two to come up there, but there will be a recording of part or all of this interview. And also please to learn more about our upcoming events, such as our hybrid fall symposium on December 8th with Dr. Pauline Mackey from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And if you enjoy events like this one tonight and want to keep them going, please also consider donating at the WGHI website or click the gift link in our chat box. And thank you all again so much for your interest and for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you all for our next events.